Okay, everyone, good evening. I would like to call the Board of Finance special meeting for Thursday, May 7th, 2020 to order. We have 4 items on the agenda. So what I would like to do is start off with public forum. It appears that what we will do has been typical just for those that are joining us. We will put everyone on mute, and if anybody would like to address the Board of Finance members in public forum, they may do so at this time. So number 1 is public forum. Anybody wishing to address the Board of Finance in public forum? And there is a raise hand tool, or if you're on video, you can certainly raise your hand by video. And I usually give it a couple of seconds so that people can find their tools or get their video on. All right, anybody else, anybody wishing to address the Board of Finance in public forum? Last call. Okay. We will move on to item number 2. Consider and take action to set the mill rate for fiscal year 2020-2021 budget pursuant to the Governor's Executive Order 7I. There's a good possibility that most of us on this call are aware of the actions that have been taken up to this point. I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and just do a quick history, and I promise I will try to be quick. But I want to make sure this gets all captured in the meeting minutes and basically reminds us of where we stand. So I just want to make sure I get my proper notes here. As of March 5th, the Board of Finance had intended to send a budget to voters, which at that time had included a reduction of $50,000 each to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education budgets, which equaled a total budget increase of 3.12% or a tax increase, aka mill rate increase of 1.44%. Last Monday, on April 27th, the Board of Finance, in response to the Governor's Executive Order 7I, which we are at this point all familiar with, made further reductions to the Board of Selectmen, Board of Education budgets, $100,000 to the Board of Selectmen and $200,000 to the Board of Education. This ended up resulting in a total budget increase that was approved of 2.83% or a tax increase of 1.13%. And at this time, if we were to set the mill rate, I would note that that mill rate would be at 32.39. I did want to note that these budgets and mill rate increases did include a 10.29% increase in the debt service, which we cannot touch, and of which about half of that is composed of the last increase that is going to be attributed to the Guilford High School building project. So I think that's a brief enough, I hope, summary of where we stand right now. So before setting the mill rate tonight, I just wanted to kind of set the stage. For fiscal year 2021, before we set it, we need to consider, as we know, our estimated revenue projections, of which we know from the spreadsheets we've been given over time, 94% of that is attributable to property taxes. The other 6% is equal to just over $500,000. It's about 510, about almost approaching $511,000 of other tax revenue, of other non-tax revenue. So we left the meeting last Monday on the 27th, and there were a few questions and considerations we were going to have. And so at this point, I'm going to basically rifle through the questions and ask for input, mostly at this point from Mary Jane and our first selectman, Mary Jane Malvasi, our finance director, and Matt Hoey, our first selectman. on the town side, and of course, Linda Trudeau and Dr. Freeman on the Board of Education side. And these questions will sound familiar from where we stood last Monday after we approved the budget and before we set the mill rate. I guess one of the questions would be if there are any anticipated changes in the current line items that are going to make up the amount that I had just mentioned of the non-tax revenue of $510,000. This is different from the question that will be about surplus. This is more just about the projection that we have on the revenue that we've already been presented. That is non-tax revenue. And Mary Jane, that's more of a question for you to address if there's been any changes in those line items.
Specifically, no. State revenue and all the local revenues are projected to be the same for next year. Not sure if any or all of those will come in for next year. Obviously, the remainder of this year, I'm estimating our revenue coming in at about 30%. I said that last month, and for the month of April, that's about almost exactly where we came in, about 30% different than April last year. So to answer your question, the numbers haven't changed unless we want to look at them and make any changes based on where we are with COVID.
Okay. Let me open that question up to Board of Finance members. And I have the line items in front of me based on the spreadsheet that we've been given that has really, it's the revenue summary and mill rate calculation that we've all gotten in the past. Does anybody have any concerns? I know one of them we had some concern about was interest income based on the interest rates right now and the way they've gone lower. But I know we were conservative in that estimate, Mary Jane, when the budget was set. So we are projecting about $50,000 more than what we're estimating for next year. Let me see if I said that right. We're projecting revenue for this fiscal year 50,000 more than we will next year for next fiscal year.
Well, I can say that we should be able to bring in 100% of our revenue in the current fiscal year.
Right.
So the 425,000, we had anticipated a higher amount, which is why we budgeted the 575 next year, although the 575 was still conservative based on where we were heading. Mm-hmm. So that's my story. Okay.
So right now that you're still feeling comfortable with that interest income amount that we budgeted for next year, based on the way we've looked at it.
If interest rates were to come back, that would be a good number. Yes. Okay. It does have some leeway in it. So if we have a couple of months of revenue loss, also keep in mind that with the 30-day deferment of taxes, we won't be getting all of our revenue from taxes right away. So there'll be a delay in the interest anyway.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions on the line items that there are here? There's about 8 of them. Does anybody have any questions before I go on to the next question that I would have? Okay, we could always come back to it if it comes up, someone has a question. One of the items that we brought up.
Mike, I'm sorry to be a little late. I was on the mute button.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
Mary Jane doesn't have any concerns about the other items, right?
Doesn't, no.
Okay, that was my question.
Okay.
Well,
I don't want to. Go ahead.
Building permits and town clerk revenue are also down during this time. So they would be similar to the interest income lines. EMS revenue is a little bit down, but our ambulance is still running. So that number is hopefully good. And the state revenue, like I said, that's the budgeted state revenue. I'm not sure if at this point, I haven't heard anything to lead me to believe that the state will change what they're anticipated to give us, but clearly that could change at any time.
Okay.
So that, I think that answers all the line items.
Right.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Let's go on to the next question. We could always go back, like I said. So one of the things we talked about was in the past years, we have had surpluses, some larger than others, of course, based on numerous factors. I know last meeting we had asked about the town and the Board of Education projections, which again are simply estimates. They are not anything that are, you know, these numbers are, they could fluctuate, and we know we actually have 2 more months in this fiscal year. I know that Mary Jane, you had mentioned somewhere in the vicinity, I think, of 275,000 as a projection for surplus going into or approaching June 30th, or at the end of June 30th. And of course, I'm mentioning this, and none of this is set in stone until the audit, which comes several months later. But 275 on the town side, and I believe it was 225 on the Board of Education side, or somewhere thereabouts. What are your, Linda or Mary Jane, what are your thoughts or current, you know, we're only 10 days away from that last meeting, but any further thoughts that you would see affecting those projections that you estimated at that point?
I'll start only because I'm unmuted and Linda's not. My projection remains the same. As I said previously and at the last meeting, I estimated approximately 30% for the last 3 months, and that's kind of what came in April. So I stand by my number from last meeting. Okay. To the best of my ability.
Of course, of course. Of course. Linda?
So with the same disclaimer as Mary Jane just used, to the best of my ability, we're just going to stick with the between 200 to maybe 250,000. But the one thing that I want to add, which we hadn't talked about earlier today, Mary Jane and I exchanged some emails about a prior year excess cost funds that were sent to the town as part of their ECS payment. I had originally told Mary Jane that we were going to request those funds. We have since I've discussed it with Dr. Freeman, and we've changed our mind. We are not going to request those funds. We're going to keep them with the town. So we're going to leave that $80,000 with the town to use towards their surplus if or help.
Okay, so I did not include that 80,000 in my projection because I thought Linda was going to be requesting it.
Understood.
Yeah, it's a change from our earlier conversation today. So
that's quite all right. We can change tomorrow again, but I just wanted it to be clear that I had not anticipated holding on to that 80,000.
And obviously, us not taking that might trend us closer to the 2 rather than the high side of 2, but it's doesn't matter if it's going to remain in surplus, if it remains on the town side or on our side. We have requested it in past years when we've been running in deficit on tuition, and so we don't see a reason to make that request this year, knowing that we'll be in some significant surplus.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mary Jane and Linda. And so what we're looking at, combined, possibly, estimated, projected, again, is somewhere in the vicinity of 475 to 525,000 based on those 2 numbers. So somewhere in that plus or minus $500,000 range. The third question that I'm going to ask, and this is again something that came up Monday, just to confirm more than anything, is the amount of surplus that we would need, if realized on a surplus, what would be needed for the amount that'd be attributable to the unassigned fund balance to maintain the level that we're now at, which is at 10%, which is a number that we've strived to get to over the past years, several years, and a number that we've been trying to keep as much as possible. We'll have further discussion about that in the unassigned fund balance, but it's my understanding, Mary Jane, that that's an amount somewhere about $300,000 that we would need to contribute to the unassigned fund balance out of any surplus to maintain the 10%.
If you look at 10% of the total expenditure budget, we
Right.
would not need anything to be added, mainly because we've come in slightly over 10 this past year. So we could stay where we are and still be at 10%.
All right. What do you know? What's the amount? What was the audit amount? 10 point, was it
5.
10? It was 10.5?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. All right. Those are the three questions I had really for Mary Jane and Linda. And so and again, any Board of Finance members, obviously ask questions as you'd like to. Also, I'm just kind of, again, setting some parameters here. Based on those responses, there were a couple of items that we were looking at. We wanted to look at mitigating any tax increase for next year. And again, I say mitigate or minimize any tax increase that we can. We were looking at possibly utilizing any excess surplus above the amount that would need to get us to or keep us at the 10% level of unfunded, unassigned fund balance. And a couple of us had actually looked at a goal of getting, if we could, raising the mill rate less than 1% and getting it lower than where we are now at the 1.13% that resulted in the further reductions we made last week. So I basically present those items, and I know that if we were to set a mill rate and we discussed the 1% number, if we set a mill rate of 32.34, let me rephrase that, 32.34, as opposed to 32.39, which I said before, which would give us the 1.13, we would be 0.97% of a tax increase or mill rate increase were we to do this. I did want to make a note that we're all aware of that, there's always a risk of using any level of unassigned fund balance or any surplus to look as a revenue source. We have to find it again next year. But I know that if we're looking at an amount that is we would need $150,000. The 150 would need to come out of either the surplus, any amount of surplus above and beyond an amount that we deem, we were talking about 300,000 possibly, but Mary Jane just indicated that to keep a flat 10%, we don't necessarily need to add anything. And whatever we do get in surplus could be attributed to next year, but it's a line item that we would have to replace as a revenue item. And I do know that, what we've been talking about is trying to do these three things I mentioned before. And I think that trying to use some revenue source, if at all, whether it's surplus or unassigned fund balance, that we're being empathetic to some of the input we heard from many letters that we received. Again, we were at, I think, 180 letters received from the community. And we do have a reasonable amount to use, a reasonable amount to think that we may need to use next year. That was a huge concern that we had, that this year we're going to be probably doing a little bit better than what we may do next year. And the further concern is long-term impact of 21, 22, and what may impact our budget at that point. Governor's budget being one, increased expenses on the Board of Education side that we are not aware of yet, that we've heard a lot about, and we could certainly consider those items. And there's a lot of other impacts that we may see that we do not know whether or not we're going to have to take a bigger draw out of unassigned fund balance for that one-time issue that is the proper use of a rainy day fund as opposed to trying to bring taxes down. We may have to be reactive as opposed to proactive. And that's something that I think before we set a mill rate, we need to be cognizant of. So I do want to throw that out there and open it up to any further comment and thoughts on setting the mill rate and where we should be.
Mike, I guess I would motion that we take $500,000 of the surplus from this budget year and use it to mitigate the tax increase.
Okay. Let me, let's see. I know that is something, now, just so you know, that is something that has been thought about and considered. So I want to just indicate what those numbers would be. Again, Jonathan.
Well, if
just-
someone will give it a second, maybe we can.
Right,
discuss
I
it.
just want to make sure you put that in the form of a motion, right?
Yeah,
Okay, I just want to make sure I heard
put it in
motion.
a form of a motion.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
It doesn't have to be approved if someone seconds it. We can just discuss it.
Well,
I mean, I'll second it for discussion.
you second for discussion? Okay, that's fine. All right, discussion. If we were to do a $500,000 unassigned fund balance or surplus or however, because we'd have to find that money. That increase, we would have and I do have the numbers here because I wanted to make sure I was prepared for whatever number we came up with. The mill rate increase would be a 0.61 increase and would be at 32.23. So I just wanted to indicate what that impact would be in terms of a tax increase on the mill rate on percentage. I would like to hear everybody else's thoughts on that amount because I know there was some discussion that we've had about a $500,000 use. And I think the biggest concern that some of us have are the use of, the finding of that next year, finding $500,000. However, I will pose this question that if we do realize a surplus of $450,000 to $500,000 and apply it to next year, we do have to find it. But we also, the one thing that we will be able to do apparently is maintain a 10% unassigned fund balance to our expenditure budget. So any further thoughts on?
So Mike, I'll just say that, I'm trying to advance, I think, a sentiment from our last meeting to try to put some kind of surplus towards the mitigating the mill rate for this year.
Understood.
Just to put it forward. So, the amount is negotiable. I can even amend this motion, but, it seemed like there was sentiment to do that at our last meeting. So I'm, gladly putting it on the table again.
Okay.
Consider it this meeting.
Okay. I'll open up to further discussion from the board.
Mr. Chairman, just a kind of a question. Are we working on the premise that budget spending will be automatically higher next year? We keep talking about finding the money, and it's not just a question of finding the funding. Sometimes it's a question of reducing the expenses.
It's a question of doing both. And in the past, I think Mary Jane could attest to the fact that we've been fortunate on the revenue side, more so based on the way we've been budgeting and some conservative budgeting that we've done, where we thought the governor was going to cut more money out of our ECS. That was one issue from last year, and other years where we thought we were going to get cut on revenues and we did not experience it. Thankfully, we had representation up at the legislature that helped mitigate any decreases in revenue. But yes, it would be a mix. It would, the wild card here is what kind of expenditures are we going to see because of the COVID-19 situation? So that's the wild card on that. So we could reduce expenditures and find that money. Again, it's a swing, right? If we find that we don't spend $500,000 next year, then we don't have to pull out of unassigned fund balance, because that's where, that's going to be money saved. But that's as far as I know, from what I've heard, I think that's a real long shot.
Because obviously my overwhelming concern is that the revenues just won't be there. And, if we will look anything like the rest of the country, we're just not going to have the revenue. So we're going to have to look, I think, for extraordinary cuts. And of course we can't, the state is going backwards, and it's doing, putting all the stimulus in, I understand, but that means that they're going to have to make some very difficult decisions when it comes to municipalities.
Right.
And so I'm quite concerned about the revenue just not showing up, and we will have to cut. So, it's in the game of finance, this is a timing question more than anything else. It's almost financial semantics. Is it, sticking to 10% or not, is it,
right,
is the surplus the same thing as, 10, part of the 10% rainy day fund, or isn't it? And I'm a little less concerned about nailing the 10%, because I think that's going to go away on us at some point anyway, whether we like it or not.
In a reactive mode of covering for expenditures that we're not anticipating based on the situation.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, there's certain things that we just can't not do. We can't not service the debt, and there are certain contractual obligations that we have to maintain. But just anticipating that we're always going to find the money from the revenue side, I think, is nowhere to go. We've got no room on that.
Right.
Mike, I've got a question. Do you recall last meeting what the number was that was proposed for taking surplus and using it to reduce the mill rate last meeting? Was it 150?
50.
Well, yeah, it was yes. The assumption was that we would need to, now the $300,000 that was presented, Mary Jane, I'm sorry, I saw your hand up, and I'll get to you in a second. The $300,000 was, I believe, to maintain exactly what our unassigned fund balance percentage is now. Mary Jane, is that correct?
That's what was discussed at last meeting, yes.
Right. So to maintain a 10% when we have over 10% indicates that we have some room to be able to take out of it. To go to Bob's concern is that, okay, $500,000 is something that we need to discuss in terms of how much we're going to possibly need next year, and especially with the fact that we may not even find the expenditures to be saved, if not spending a lot more.
I don't think I phrased this question right. I thought there was actually a motion on the table last meeting that we would take $150,000 of surplus and move it to reduce the mill rate.
No. The only thing we did, Jonathan, to just confirm, is the only thing we did is we reduced the budgets on the expenditure side, which we needed to do before the May 7th.
Yeah, I thought the motion got amended, and we ended up with just $300,000.
It was my motion, Jonathan, and it was amended. I removed the part about the surplus or the unfunded balance because we weren't sure about that.
Okay, that's what I was
you're
asking.
recalling.
I just wonder if the sentiment was still there to do that.
Thank you, Veronica,
to some
for
degree.
clarifying. Thank you. Okay, yeah. Mary Jane, I want to go back to you. Do you want to address Bob? When Bob was speaking, you had your hand up.
Well, I just wanted to make two comments, and I don't want to speak for Matt, so he can give me googly eyes if he wants to. But next year, if the revenues aren't coming in, we will mitigate our expenses immediately, and
Yes, we will.
make sure that contractual items are paid, like Bob said. But in the same way we handled the reduction in state aid that year, we mitigated our expenses and made sure that we weren't spending more than we were bringing in. And also another option for your rainy day fund is to use that next year in the event that additional revenues don't come in. Just because you don't budget them doesn't mean we can't use them. But I just wanted to make the Board of Finance aware that we're not going to go out and just spend the money because we have the budget for it. We will be watching that, especially with our cash flow those first 3 months, and even beyond if we get another spike and something happens.
Okay, just so you know, I saw Matt and I saw Dr. Freeman both. So Matt, you go first and then Dr. Freeman.
Yep. Mary Jane, thanks for pointing out the obvious. We will be monitoring expenses against our revenue flows throughout the year. And you're right, there will be some challenges early on because of the decisions we made to provide a 90-day deferral for our taxpayers. And I want to pick up on a point that Bob made, which is the one that I made the other day or last week, cautioning against the use of significant amounts of fund balance, because I'm not sure that this is the appropriate time to do that. The appropriate time would seem to me to use that fund when we know we have a problem on the revenue side, and that's what the rainy day fund or the unassigned fund balance is for. Just as a quick aside, the $500,000 that Jonathan just proposed for discussion purposes only would result in about a 0.16 mil increase. So you would be starting off your budget deliberations next fall with a 0.16 mil hole in your revenue budget that you'd have to fill somewhere else. So I just wanted to caution that. And I'm going to again say that I too am concerned about what's going to happen with local revenues next year. There are really, a couple of components to the revenue side that could be at risk. Local revenues from things like ambulance revenue, golf course revenue, youth and family services. That's one. Tax delinquencies, taxes not being paid because of the struggles that some of our community members will have. And then lastly, although the numbers are baked in the biennial budget, the state is going to be under significant pressure as well. And it's my hope that they don't go to the municipalities for any reductions mid-year. Governor has the ability to do revisions of 5% at least once during the course of the year. Now, the good and bad news is we don't get an awful lot from the state, so a 5% revision wouldn't cripple us, but we have to be realistic. It might be there. If any or all of those things happen, that's when I think we need to go to the fund balance.
Okay.
I got a just quick question for Matt. Matt, I'm just curious, that 500,000 is about 5% of our budget. If that was to go into the rainy day fund instead of going to operational budget to mitigate the mill rate, how would that create a 1.6% hole in the budget?
500,000 is not 5% of the budget, it's 0.5%.
Yeah.
Oh, roughly, right?
No, it's not.
Matt, just to clarify, I believe when you said the increase, I think the increase if we were to take a $500,000, use that for revenue, it was 0.61.
It's 0.16 when you work it against the original budget estimate. The original revenue estimates without the 500,000. It reduces. You add the 500,000 in. It reduces the mill rate by 0.16%. Or 0.16, not 0.16%.
0.16.
0.16 is the actual number. It goes from 32.39 to 32.23. You working the spreadsheet, Mike?
Oh, I see. The mill rate by
The mill rate
0.16.
itself. The mill rate itself.
It's 30.
Okay.
Yeah, it would go from 32.03 to 32.23.
Okay, I see. 0.16. I think I misheard. I thought you said 1.
I may have misspoken, Jonathan.
No, it's all right. I got it now. But I follow what you're saying.
Okay. Any further comment regarding the motion on the table?
Mr. Ells, if I may?
Yes, go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the comment about cutting costs, reducing spending. Obviously, the Board of Education has always been good team players. We've in past memory, always come in on our approved budget, even when that means cutting spending in some areas to offset overages in others. I again need to caution, and I become more concerned with each passing week. The Board of Ed may anticipate expenditures next year that are unanticipated and beyond our ability to reduce. We continue to have concerns about special education costs next year, and we cannot simply cut costs in special education when services have been identified as needed. Whatever comes out in the reopening plans that are being worked on now, we're hearing suggestions that schools may open with guidelines to open under restricted capacity. We again might be looking at alternating days of attendance. We might be looking at split sessions, which would require increases in transportation costs that haven't been budgeted for. We're hearing suggestions that we may not be allowed to have students in the classroom sit within 6 feet of each other. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we have reduced almost to none stock of single seat desks. Students sit at tables together. They sit at 2 or 3 person desks together. We may run into furniture costs next year that we have not anticipated. There may be staffing costs if we end up under the obligation of providing both in-person schooling and distance instruction as we're providing now. So again, I just want to caution the Board of Finance that, well, one, I want to the Board of Finance, we'll do everything we can to bring this school year in on our approved budget. We always have, and we've always found ways to make that work. But I am more and more concerned about the scale of unanticipated expenses that we may face next year because of state mandates about how we come to school next year, and just can't tell what those will be. So know that we will work with you. We will keep you apprised at every step along the way, but we may not simply be able to cut spending to stay within budget next year.
So Dr. Friedman, this is probably a discussion that isn't really close enough for this meeting, but I was curious if you could fit all the students in the building 6 feet apart, if you maybe use the gym or the CAF and just creative use of space.
Fitting them and instructing them are going to be two incredibly different questions. I have heard suggestions about filling gymnasiums with desks that are spaced 6 feet apart. We might be able to hold students in that condition for a school day. I don't know how we would be expected to instruct students in that condition for a school day, and especially for repeated school days, if this is a condition that goes on for weeks or months at a time. Right, we don't, quite honestly, if that became the choice, I might lean towards maintaining distance learning because it's a better delivery model than putting 1,000 students into the high school gymnasium and trying to do something with them while they sit in chairs in that gymnasium for 6 hours and 15 minutes a day. So we're working on that, Jonathan. And no, we haven't gone out and sort of measured the buildings. I can't tell you what the capacity of one of our standard classrooms. We don't have a standard size classroom. They're all different sizes. We're fortunate in Guilford that we tend to have favorable class sizes right now. Class sizes at the elementary level tend to be around 18 or 18 and a half per class. But I don't know how many we can fit into a standard elementary classroom with 6 foot distancing. I doubt that it's 18. But that is a project Cliff and I will probably have to take on in the next few days.
Yep, I could understand there's quite a few challenges in that kind of prospect.
And I just want to add, just so everyone can kind of think about the kinds of things we have to think about. If we have that issue, we also have it with buses. Right?
Correct.
If we're not going to be able to put the standard number of kids on a school bus because they can't possibly be 6 feet apart. Just the ramifications of this are really quite extensive. And again, as Dr. Freeman said, there's so much we don't know, but it's really hard to imagine how any of these things, if they are not the typical way we run a school, how any of these things don't cost money for us in a significant way. You know, it's so hard to know what that looks like right now. but these are all things that we may be facing in the fall.
I would
Bob,
think it also
I couldn't-
goes,
Oh, hold on, Veronica and then Bob.
I was just going to comment that I think not only in terms of cost, I think it's going to be a matter of resources. There's going to be a shortage of resources because it's going to be faced by 169 other school districts. So in terms of needing additional buses, you know, there's other resources that are going to be needed. So
Correct.
But I wanted to make the comment that I'm sure Dr. Freeman, Dr. Balstraci are highly aware of this, but the thing I hear about all the time is the people on the front line of the parents who are at home with the kids with distance learning, who are giving up revenue or giving up jobs or can't go to work or can't afford daycare. And it cuts both ways. So I'm sure you're aware of it. It's just not being brought up terribly much. It's tough on the taxpayers.
Absolutely, it absolutely cuts both ways. You know, and as you can imagine, you know, none of these things are going to be easy decisions, and we're having to think about students and families, and we're having to think about the health of both, and it's a very complicated puzzle that's going to have to be solved in September, and of course not one that we can solve right now because there's so much unknown between now and then.
And I'll say again, I mentioned it probably 3 weeks ago, and I probably don't mention it enough. My responsibility in this meeting is simple. I was hired by the town of Guilford to advocate for education and to advise all of you about educational needs. All of you clearly have the much more complicated job in balancing these competing needs. But I would not be meeting my responsibility if I didn't continue to make you aware of what we see as educational needs and costs on the horizon. And I don't envy a single one of you your responsibility in balancing these two equally important competing needs.
Jeff, I saw that you did the raise hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I mentioned this at our meeting last week, but again, I think it bears repeating, you know, and it's been mentioned several times already. We just don't know what next year or the year after is going to look like. And we may need the undesignated fund balance at a scale that we wouldn't, if we looked back, we would say those idiots didn't put the money aside when they should have, just because the future is unknown, and the costs associated with the school district are, you know, incredibly complicated in terms of getting it back up and running. But the same is true on the town side. I mean, I know how our firefighters and how our police officers are going to go about doing their jobs, how Public Works and Park and Rec are going to go about doing their jobs when we're finally allowed to go back to a more normal life than we're leading right now, is going to bring with it all sorts of costs. And I have every confidence in the administration and the faculty and the department heads throughout the town that they're going to look to try and do it as efficiently as possible and not try to spend money unnecessarily. But there's going to come a point, in my opinion, where they're not going to have any alternative but to spend money on equipment, but to spend money on additional vehicles or furniture or things of that sort, that we just don't know what those costs are. And so while I appreciate the desire, and I share the desire to reduce the impact on the taxpayer, I do think that, you know, as I said last week, it's raining now, but I think it's going to start raining a lot harder over the next year. And I want to make sure that we're in a position to be ready for that when I think that's going to happen. And hopefully I'm wrong, but if I'm not, I'd rather make sure that we're prepared for it down the road than make a more substantial adjustment right now. That's just my feeling on this.
The one thing that I just wanted to note is that in setting the mill rate, it could, as was already alluded to by members, it's, you know, considering expenses and revenues, right? So when we set it, it could come from either direction. It could come from savings, or it could come from a withdrawal out of our unassigned. And anticipating that we're going to get a surplus, or anticipating that we're going to draw out of unassigned, or anticipating that there's going to be $500,000 worth of savings. And none of that we know. I think the one thing that I will say, I want to make sure everyone had a chance to speak that wants to. I personally think a $500,000 withdrawal is a lot. I wouldn't want to do that. I know we're going to probably need to look at something down the road, and at least be prepared to be reactive as opposed to utilizing it now. I am not against using some level of the surplus that we're hearing that we may get. That, again, if it's a surplus and we can use it, great. If it ends up being an amount that's in savings, that's fine too. But I think ultimately, are we trying to hit a number on the mill rate and the percentage, or are we okay with, where it is now? Again, it's a very difficult decision. I wouldn't be willing to go 500. I'd be willing to go more in the 200 range, based on what I'm hearing tonight, maybe half of the 500. And again, this is because of listening and knowing that there is an impact that's happening on taxpayers right now. But they need to know that next year, we're going to have a real challenge trying to find not just some of the revenues possibly, but an increased amount of expenses. And again, I've said this to members of the community. It is a balancing act that we really don't know. So the question is the comfort level of utilizing a $500,000. And again, I want to make this clear that what we're doing is the motion is setting a mill rate, not approving a revenue budget. We're considering the revenue budget. So I do want to make that clear that we do have a motion on the table. And as I was thinking about it, really that motion would need to be, I think, again, trying to go by what I know here.
Mike, if it'll build some
it needs to be
sentiment and some
setting a mill
support,
rate that takes into account both the expenses and the revenues. So
Mike, if it'll build some sentiment and some support, I'll amend that motion to be a number for 250,000. If you think that's something more reasonable and that there's some support.
well, I don't know. I don't know if we've heard from everybody. So
What's
All
the
right.
impact to the mill rate? If it's 250, what's the difference?
32.31, 0.87 is the increase.
We've got a lot of imponderables here. Am I on?
Yes, you
Yes,
are.
you
Ken.
are.
Okay. A lot of numbers been thrown around, and my heart goes out to on the education side, having been in it for years. And to understand the challenges, both on the town side and on the education side, it's overwhelming, really, for us. We can only act, I think, on the basis of providing some within our purview, providing some latitude for taxpayer relief if we can. I'm attracted by getting the mill rate under 1 for its symbolic value more than anything else. But I'm mindful of the fact that there are many costs coming down the road. And as I think Matt said, we're going to get the real impact of this in 21, 22. So we have the opportunity now to move reasonably within the existing parameters and to look down the road as to as Bob said, what the impact on parents will be going forward, because there's going to be more stress on them, and it will have economic implications. To look over at the school side and see the possibility of furniture purchases, extending bus possibilities. It's enormous. I think the revenue seems to be holding in there. I think all we can do as a board is act on what's before us right now. I don't think we can anticipate the sweeping changes. The governor has the right within this biennial budget and beyond to reduce us still further, reduce all the municipalities by about another 5% over the course of this 2-year budget. We have to wait and see what that can be. The only thing before us is to provide some immediate relief without being reckless. And I would like to see us get under the 1% on that. I'm very mindful of what we're facing in education and on the town side. Nobody has even mentioned the need for infrastructure repair within the school system, within the town. So there are a lot of issues here, and I think we can act prudently and conservatively. I'm not opposed to the 250, but I would like to see the 500 if we could do it.
Okay.
My sense is that the difference between 1%, 87 basis points, and wherever 500,000 lands us is in dollars and cents to taxpayers is more optical than economic. I'd second the 250 because I think that makes everybody happy, and gets us down to 87 basis points, Mike.
0.87, yes.
To go beyond, and then, I mean, I'm listening. I'm less impressed by preserving this 10% rainy day fund, but some people smarter than I are very impressed with maintaining that. And if that helps us maintain the 10% this year, next year's another budget.
I think we have to anticipate further use of that next year and in 21-22. We do. So I'd lean toward the 250 to make it a minimal touch right now.
So what would the mill rate be if we anticipate $250,000 coming in? What would the new mill rate be?
32.31.
And the increase would be what?
I'm
Point
actually,
0.87.
I'm sorry, say that again. 0.87, yeah.
0.87.
I'm wanting to actually plug this into the spreadsheet just to confirm the number. 32.31, 0.87.
Just as an aside, when we're looking at the two boards, and they gave us they gave back 50 each on the first go round, and then another 200 on the education side and 100 on the town side on the second go around. So they have actually cut. Let's not lose sight of that. They've cut $400,000 from the budgets that we thought were reasonably prepared and presented over these two series of cuts.
Matt?
Yes,
You had a raised hand?
I did. I just want to continue to reiterate that every dollar you use from fund balance this year, you need to find a replacement for it next year. And it's either of two places. It's going to come from unassigned fund balance again, or it's going to come in the form of tax increases, just to get back to the spending level you already authorized a week ago.
Right.
Just what bit of caution. I'll probably remind you of that in January and February when we have budget meetings.
We know, and we know you're passionate about that, and I respect that.
I know.
We all respect that.
I know, but these are unusual times, and Mike,
Well, it
using
is.
some unassigned fund balance right now is probably appropriate. I just caution on every dollar that you add to what Jonathan had mentioned was a $150,000 number a week ago. Every dollar you add to that is one you have to find again next year.
So I would ask two things. Is there any further discussion on this? And Jonathan, would you, if I put it to vote, before I do that, would you have any, would you want to amend it at all? And make it a different number
Yeah,
than
I'll
500?
formally amend the motion to take $250,000 from the surplus from our current year budget and to use that to be applied as revenue to next year's budget so as to reduce the mill rate by, was it?
Well,
27.
ultimately, it would be to set the mill rate at 32.31.
To set the mill rate at 32.31.
I'll second that.
Just a point of clarification, you're
Sure, go
taking it from unassigned fund balance, right? Not anticipated surplus, as you can't do it that way. It's
It was-
So
unassigned-
my understanding was
Yeah.
anticipated surplus.
No, you can't
This
do
is-
it. You can't take an amount
Right.
from an anticipated number. You have to take it from a source that you know is there.
We're hoping the surplus is realized that gets put into the unassigned fund balance that
Right.
that will be
Offset it.
withdrawn.
Correct.
It's an offset.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll rephrase then that we do take 250,000 from
Mary
the
Jane?
designated fund balance.
Mary
And
Jane's raising her
we'll
hand.
apply it to next year's budget as a revenue source so as to reduce the mill rate to 32.31. Does that sound at least correct?
That sounds correct. Very-
All right,
Wait a minute, we need, there's a
Get
motion,
that
I gotta take a
phrased
second.
correctly.
Second.
All right, Veronica seconded. Mary Jane.
I just wanted to clarify and follow up on Matt's comment that in the budget, there will be a revenue source transfer in from undesignated fund balance.
Okay,
But just to follow up on that, if the projections that we're hearing are accurate, we should end up with a surplus sufficient to
cover that.
replace that
Yep.
and have additional funds available to slightly increase or at least maintain it where it is right now.
Correct. At the end of this fiscal year, any surplus will automatically transfer into your fund balance. So whether it's more or less, whatever it is, it's going to go into fund balance. And then in the next year, it will come out. But as Matt said, I can't take this year's fund balance and just put it into next year's budget. It's going to fall into fund balance. We'll have all those discussions on what they are at the end of the year, and then a revenue source will come in from fund balance. And I can only say that if the revenues come in where we had anticipated, it is possible we would not need the use of fund balance. If they come in less than we anticipate, we might need more.
And just to add something, just from what we know today, the estimated surplus is in the vicinity of 500 or 525,000. Okay,
It could be as low as 475 based on our current projections. So the range is 475 to 525.
okay. Further discussion before I call for a vote?
Call the question.
Okay. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye, and if not, signify by saying nay. We'll do it that way. We got to do roll call. So Megan Scanlon,
Aye.
Veronica Wallace,
Aye.
Ken Gammerman,
Aye.
Mike Ailes, aye. Jeff Beatty,
Aye.
John Trotta,
abstain.
Bob Hartman.
Aye.
Okay,
I know.
Jonathan.
I have to ask after this, why the abstention?
I just don't feel that I should be voting on the budget in place of the constituents. I'm not comfortable with it. But I'm trying to give you some motions that I feel would help the residents of Guilford, so. Just
Okay, okay,
Yep.
thank you. Thank you for the explanation. Okay. We've gotten through item number 2.
Mr.
Are we-
Chairman, just for clarification,
Clarification, yeah, go ahead.
can you just say now what the mill rate was going to be, just so the public has no, so I have an understanding. 32.31
Which
for
is,
a mill rate increase of 0.87. Is that correct?
that is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Moving on, if we're all ready, for item number 3. I have prepared notes on this one as well. I got to stay online for these things. So item number 3 is discuss and take possible action pursuant to Governor's Executive Order 7S to authorize municipal general obligation bonds or notes to be issued in anticipation of such bonds for capital improvement purposes as requested by the Board of Education. Okay. So originally, as you all know, last week, we had raised the concern of the $2.6 million bonding that was requested by the Board of Education, which we know was also to be voted on at budget referendum. We had agreed at that meeting that based on the Governor's Executive Order 7S, item 7, and meeting the requirements of the order, that I ended up having a conversation with Dr. Freeman, Board of Education Chair, Dr. Val Stracy, and Director of Facilities, Cliff Gurnham, who are all on the call today or during this for this meeting. This resulted in what I basically adding discussion of bonding for capital improvements to this meeting several days ago. That was under my direction. And that was with an assumption that we were going through the correct process based on the executive order. So yesterday I had provided resources to the Board of Finance, and those were also provided to Tracy to post as part of the public record. And these were all documents that were justifying that one of the projects, one of them that was actually part of the bond resolution to be voted on, would be looked to be approved under the conditions of the Executive Order 7S7. I think it would be good, and I know we have, there goes, sorry about that. I know we have Matt Ritter on the line, or I shouldn't say on the line, in the Zoom meeting, to address some of the issues that we came across. I will indicate that, in short, that any project based on the executive order has to do the following things. It has to have an action that's necessary to permit the orderly operation of the municipality. There's a need to act immediately. You have to, there needs to be a, actually I should say there's a need to act immediately in order to avoid endangering public health and safety and welfare. There's a need to prevent significant financial loss, and the item needs to be necessary for the protection of persons and property within the municipality. I'm literally just paraphrasing from the areas that we need to meet per the executive order. So per the info sent and posted, you all saw the Baldwin Middle School HVAC work was believed to meet all the conditions, and hopefully you read all that material that was sent. That was actually directed by Dr. Freeman and by Cliff Gurnham. This morning, on the recommendation of Town and Bond Council, of which we have Matt Ritter on the line, it was agreed that the possible action of the Board of Finance to authorize bonding for this, or for in fact any project from that bond, may not completely meet the interpretation of the executive order. When attorneys say that, you listen, and therefore after the call this morning, we've had a bit of a change of process. I am not the expert here, but I feel very comfortable that Matthew Ritter, who's from Shipman and Goodwin, who's also our bond council representative, will be able to summarize the executive order and the process that we're going to follow. And Matt, at this point, I'd like to hand the floor over to you to provide some detail.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Good evening, everybody here. And you said it well. So when we saw the agenda, right, the first thing that we wanted to kind of just take a step back, these are obviously every way you're adopting things. I just listened to your budget debate, right? You are adopting a budget in a very different manner than you normally do. And so one of the goals of these executive orders in 7S Section 7 is we understand under COVID-19, things aren't going to be the same as they always were. It's not possible. We want you to try to adhere to the normal process as best as possible. So what we recommend at Shipman would be to put the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance votes after having an electronic special town meeting. Give taxpayers and residents an opportunity to weigh in at a special town meeting. That's how you would normally do it under your charter, right? Because you're over $1 million with this authorization. You'd go to a special town meeting and adjourn it to referendum. If you make the decision that you're going to do it through the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance and not go to referendum under 7S Section 7, we still wanted a minimum for you to have this special town meeting. So I think the revised plan would be, again, trying to do our best to adhere to a normal process in really unusual times, and that can be difficult to do. We'd have the Board of Selectmen tomorrow set the pass a resolution to call for a special town meeting to be held on Thursday. That would provide notice in the newspaper on Saturday, which is within the 5 days requirement under the state statutes. Then we have the town meeting on Thursday. In addition to the town meeting where people could ask questions, just like for your budget process, there's an email address where folks can email and ask questions as to what's going on here. Then after that special town meeting, after receiving public feedback, if the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance in their wisdom decide pursuant to the executive order to authorize both the appropriation and the issuance of bonds and notes to finance the appropriation for the Baldwin Middle School project, you can move forward. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned very clearly, bond counsel, when we sign these opinions that things are duly authorized, we take a very conservative view. And so one of the important things at this town meeting and in the records of meeting minutes, and I look at the superintendent, Dr. Freeman, as well, it's important to make the case. The cases that I saw in the documents you sent were both one, significant financial loss with respect to the Johnson Controls energy performance contract. Demonstrating that is going to be very important. And the second part is that the temperature makes it difficult for children to learn. It could have a detrimental impact on the orderly running of the public school system, or the middle school in this case for the town of Guilford Board of Education, and it could even have health impacts on students. So making the case, as the chairman laid out what the executive order wants, is important. I think the town meeting's a really good time to do that.
Thank you, Matt. Anybody have any further questions? Because I do want to make sure that we also address and make sure we're clear on what the request now is going to be of the Board of Education, which is the Baldwin HVAC project. And I specifically, I told Cliff, you have to be there. So I appreciate you being on this call, Cliff, and Dr. Balistraci, and of course, Dr. Freeman, as usual. So does anybody have any questions for Matt while he's taking his time out to address us tonight?
Well, thanks.
Okay. Did everybody get a chance to look at the material that was sent and the reasoning behind it? I guess, Cliff, if you could provide, maybe Cliff, if you just go ahead and provide a little bit of input on, and I know the memo originally came from Dr. Freeman that was posted, but I know you had a lot to do with that, the creation of that in terms of the meeting the requirements of the executive order. I think one of the questions that we would have is, and I know I had it originally, and I think a couple of our board members did, is why Baldwin HVAC and not the Lakes project, which has been fraught with issues all along. And I know the other two, just to take them off the table, we know that the Baldwin, I believe the Baldwin windows and the design services for future projects would not meet the letter of the law of that executive order. So we took those immediately off the table. But Lakes, I know, was a question for some of us. After I heard the reasoning, I can tell you that I feel much more comfortable with your process of evaluating it versus what I originally thought. So Cliff, if you could provide some feedback on that, appreciate it.
Yeah, very simply put, and I know, or I believe that you can check with Paul and the Board of Ed. But I think it was about a year or 2 years ago, we already forgot that Baldwin failed for multiple days of losing heat because of the antiquated systems in that building. So we know that we're having problems presently, and we're chasing Guilford Lakes to some extent, kind of what we were doing with Baldwin 2 years ago. So to put Baldwin on the back burner because we're now starting to see these same effects coming through to Guilford Lakes would be a huge mistake. So pulling up now and switching programs just puts us back into a middle school that's twice the size of an elementary school that has the similar problems that we've been dealing with. So, you know, Baldwin does have similar issues. They had a problem last year where we were chasing the band room all season, trying to maintain a temperature over 65 degrees. So that school has its own issues and concerns. So I feel staying with Baldwin, finishing what we started, taking the time out to design properly the replacement system for Guilford Lakes, which we haven't done yet. That will take about 6 to 9 months to do. So switching over and funding that now doesn't accomplish anything. There's no work that I can do this summer towards that project. The earliest I could be effective and do any type of equipment upgrades in that building to any large scale would be the summer of 2021. So again, that's why we need to focus on Baldwin. We've designed it, we bid it. We're right at the front door of finishing this project, and that ties into finishing the energy performance contract. And again, it stops us from holding up the energy performance contract, both in the controls manner, but also on the solar. So we're putting almost, I think, 200 kW of solar on that building this fall, if everything goes according to schedule. I can't do that until I install the rest of this HVAC system because I have multiple pipes and equipment that has to get put up on that roof before I put all that equipment or all that PV up there.
And we're not dropping the request for lakes. We just don't see that we have to ask the Board of Finance to act in place of the voters. We have an election that needs to be scheduled in November. We will be asking to include the Lakes bond request as part of that election that is scheduled in November, which will still allow us, if it is approved at that time, to make the summer of 21, as Cliff just referenced. We have gone back and looked at the monies we've sunk into that school over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, we've invested in the ballpark of $100,000. We believe that those repairs will carry us through this coming school year. And again, we're not dropping the Lakes request. We just see that there's no urgency to ask the Board of Finance to act on that when we can make our argument and put it in front of the voters come November. Now, whatever that referendum looks like in November, whether it's by mail or drive-through or in person, we are more than happy making the argument for the need at the Lakes building at that time. We're ready to do the work in Baldwin this summer. And if we weren't to ask you, the Board of Finance, to act, and then the Board of Selectmen to act on Baldwin, we would lose that window. And Baldwin, we don't believe, will carry as long as Lakes will. We're already halfway through this project. We struggled all year long to keep the band room warm enough for use. So when we looked carefully at the language of the executive order, we feel that we're being responsible in asking this board to act on Baldwin. We feel we're being responsible by delaying the question on Lakes and simply attaching it to a referendum come November. We're not walking away from that request. Veronica, I heard and appreciated what you said about it at the last meeting. We're not walking away from it. I just don't mind making that argument in front of the voters. And it's not tangled into the performance contract in the way that Baldwin is.
Anybody else have any questions? Keeping in mind this tonight is simply a discussion to make sure we have enough information so that when it comes down to our vote, we're comfortable with what ends up resulting in this possibly, which is a town meeting discussion, hearing what the public has to say, and then the Board of Selectmen basically approving an appropriation. and then it would come to us. No different than it would typically after a public vote.
Mike, I have a question.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Mr. Gurman, do you happen to know how much money we may lose if we don't do this because of the Johnson Control hold up, I guess we could call it, the delay for them doing the work that they want to do with the solar panels, I think it is?
We started to try to put some numbers together this afternoon. So, we have some really, really, really rough guesstimates at this point in time. Solar, the potential for loss in solar savings is about $40,000 is what we're speculating at this point in time. And that doesn't include the loss for, the new equipment, the new controls. That's just strictly the PV.
And then do you know if this was approved, I guess, in, this month or so, when you'd start this project?
If it gets approved this month, the day after we sign the contract, we will start ordering equipment and moving forward with the project.
Okay.
It's already been bid out. I have a bidder lined up. We just need the funding and authorization to move forward.
That I don't know if that was brought up when I was looking at a couple different things. I don't know if it was brought up, but the bidding also is a possible issue because we already have the bidder. We already have it ready to go. If this project was delayed, it would usually bidders only hold their bid for 90 days. If we had to push this, then you'd have to rebid the project in
additional losses there, right?
You've got escalation. So there's a number of things that compound by delaying the project. It's not just the energy performance, it's bidding. It's the state, it's, savings on getting the work done now as opposed to fixing and repairing. And then again, you got students that are not in an environment that is, positive to teach in. So,
also curious, how long do you think the project would take?
Cliff, go ahead.
So
If
the
you know.
equipment can take up to 12 weeks to get in, 8 to 12 weeks. So normally we are ordering equipment right around this time of year. So again, we are in a very tight schedule. So the actual construction runs somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks, our normal summer. So we will start construction the day after school normally gets out, and we will finish a lot of times the day before we come back. And a lot of work happens behind the scenes even after we return to school.
Baldwin opened this year with a temporary air conditioning system. There were temporary plastic tubes. It is not unusual that we open schools while we're still finishing work, second shift and weekends. Again, this project is halfway complete. We did half of this project last summer.
I'd just like to, just a number. If we, the interest on $1.7 million of bonds at 2%, we probably pay less than 2%, is $34,000 a year. It's not a lot of money. Money is very cheap right now. So if we're going ahead with this project, it's going to save us more than that amount per year. Let's get on with it.
Good point. Good point too. Does anybody, anyone else on the board have any questions regarding? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead. Hold on. You're unmuted now.
Okay. I just want to make sure that it's clear for those who are not in an elected position or employees that tonight no action is being taken. On tomorrow, the Board of Selectmen will call a special town meeting for next Thursday night. There will be no vote at next Thursday night's meeting. It is to receive public input or to present the information. We'll hear some of the same persuasive comments from the Board of Education about the need for this. And then we will adjourn that meeting, and the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance will both on Friday move it forward. So there is, I just want to make sure everyone understands, there is no vote at the town meeting next Thursday.
Thank you, Matt. You just covered everything that I was going to say in terms of summarizing the process. So
sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Fantastic. No, it's all right. Sometimes I talk too much,
Mike, I think I got another question too, if they have some time.
All right. Go ahead.
So, just kind of hearing Dr. Friedman's comments, and then obviously reading Dr. Balistraci's letter, which was terrific. I do see that there's some case for some urgency and some financial loss, some of the language in 7S, Section 7. And, I just wanted to iterate too that, the board would be in full compliance with the order, at least in my opinion, if they, find these findings to be true and proceed without having a referendum in the town. But I would also ask, why not consider having a referendum, as the language in this order is clear, and it does say that, here, I have it here, nothing in this order shall be construed to prohibit a municipality from conducting any in-person meeting, approval process, or referendum, provided such municipality first consults with local or state public health officials and conducts such meeting, approval process, or referendum in a way that significantly reduces the risk of transmission of COVID-19. So I guess I would ask, if that alternative is available, why not
I understand
just do that?
We're in a virtual lockdown in this community right now. What are we going to do? Reopen it for that particular vote? When it should have been reopened for everything. If there was a justification for us to be locked down to this point, I think that same logic carries over to next week.
Ken, yeah. Well, Ken, there's and Jonathan, there's a couple of different points to that. And I know you've raised this a couple of different times. We talked about this regarding the budget vote, which goes, again, I think the budget vote, which was a concern, was clarified in, I believe it was Matt Ritter, it was HH. There was an executive order.
7HH.
Right.
I'm aware of it. And I think it was obvious from the language in 7HH that there was ambiguity in 7I13, but it was intended to be mandatory.
Right. So to go to your point about 7S and having a referendum in preparation for that, I know, as you know, I had given Jeff Beatty a call earlier today because I wanted to make sure that Jeff communicated with both you and with Bob regarding the process tonight. Just to make sure that you guys were on board in case you got emails saying, hey, are you going to be available for a Friday meeting next week? Jeff had actually raised the same question you did, and making sure that the public health official for the town weighed in on this. That, of course, went to Matt, our first selectman, Matt Hoey, and then it went to Dennis Johnson, our health director. There is a letter that was dated today from the health director. Again, I could read it or I could enter it into record, which indicates simply that it is advisable at this time to temporarily suspend the holdings of the typical in-person town meetings and referendums, and alternatively conduct an emergency virtual meeting for the approval of certain bonded items. And I'm paraphrasing that letter, which is here. And I could certainly send this to Tracy so it gets entered into record, but it was something that was received earlier this afternoon. Regarding the public health official weighing in on a referendum or not. I think the other issue that we're very cognizant of is, as you just heard from Mr. Gurnham, the equipment technically should have been ordered to get this project done over the summer, should have been ordered, whether it's right now or even earlier, because of the long lead time item to produce this type of equipment for the HVAC systems. I could speak on that, to that on experience. That long lead time items can be 12, sometimes 14 weeks. And if you don't get them in a timely manner, then your whole project is shot. So there is a timeliness and a time is of the essence issue with this, that had we tried to plan for a referendum in the same way, I don't think there's any way we could even consider having this project be done this summer. And it does meet the executive orders in terms of the qualifications that would need to meet. So I just wanted to make sure I addressed that there was a letter received, as well as the timing issue of this.
That very much comes
do
down
recognize the case for some urgency to get on with the project during the summer, I would assume, right, to finish it before the school year. And I am glad to see that you at least were exploring the alternative to try to do some in-person voting by consulting with the health director of the town. But I just feel like not doing an in-person vote. I think whatever that it should be a last resort. You should really think first of doing an in-person vote, and maybe delaying a referendum till it's safer, or looking at possibilities of conducting the referendum in a safe way.
And I appreciate that, but I think also what you heard from the Board of Education is that there are projects that do not meet that requirement, and they feel very comfortable in pushing that. I know Veronica, Miss Walsh doesn't particularly care for that thought, and I know some of us don't with lakes, that we would like to see that move forward. We know the expenses caused the town, but I think it was prudent for the Board of Education to say, this one we need to do, these other ones, let's wait for the vote. That's a fair assessment. And so I just wanted to mention that, again, it's a timing issue. So
that was exactly our rationale in pulling lakes out. We are not, again, we're not removing lakes. Lakes needs to be done. We just don't think that we are up against a time crunch. Remember, we've lost a month already from when this project would have been approved had it gone through the regular referendum process before COVID interrupted that process. So we've already lost a month on this project. We can't afford to lose another month while we schedule a referendum. That was our reason for requesting this course of action for Baldwin only. We feel that we cannot make those arguments as sincerely or compellingly around the Lakes project, and don't feel that we will lose a timeline if we wait and request that goes before the voters in November. It's exactly the logic that we applied to splitting this bond request into two. And we're no happier about the Lakes request than any of you on this call. We just feel that we'll get the right response in November when we make the argument at that time for Lakes.
First Selectman Hoey.
Thank you. I think anything I add at this point might be a bit superfluous, but I just wanted to make sure that the process that we have defined and are embarked on, I think, is the appropriate one at this point based on the urgency of this project. And second, the opinion of our health director, who weighed in clearly that at this time holding a town meeting, in-person town meeting and referendum was inadvisable. And I know that there is the potential that someone would say, well, why can't you do what Vernon did? I have some significant concerns relative to trying to define a process that protects voters, poll workers at 5 polling locations to do drive-up voting, that in a timeline that doesn't disenfranchise voters by restricting it to an hour or an hour and a half like Vernon did. So I think we have taken a prudent course here, and based on Dennis Johnson's letter, I think we have satisfied, even though we didn't have to, we have satisfied the condition that was outlined in 7S7.
Okay. The only thing I want to ask, is there any other questions for Mr. Ritter? As he's on the line, and I keep saying on the line, I'm so used to saying on the line, and we're all sitting here on the screen. If there's any other questions for Matt, because I do appreciate your time, Matt, but I'm sure it's getting late and you've had a long day. So and you've been on this entire call listening to the mill rate discussion. So I appreciate the fact that you took the time out to spend with us.
No problem. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Have a good one. All right, any other questions regarding either the process or the project itself? Otherwise, I'll be looking to move over to public forum and then looking to ultimately close the meeting. Okay. With no further questions, we're all good with the process. I'm going to do a quick mute all, although maybe Tracy, you already did that. I think Tracy's ahead of me. Actually, we probably don't need to do it. I don't know who's really on the line, who's not muted, but does anybody wish to address the Board of Finance in public forum as item number 4? And raising your hand on that little tool would be helpful, or everybody else is not on video, so I can't see any hands raised. Ken, were you really raising your hand in public forum?
I want to make sure it works.
It worked. All right, I don't see any raised hands from the people that are not on video. So with that, I'm going to thank you all again. This is getting really easy, this whole Zoom meeting thing. So
We're gonna have it down pat pretty soon.
hey, I got a great co-host. Just keeps me in line. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Good
wonderful
evening.
evening. Thanks for all your work. Really
Good night,
appreciate it.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Stay safe.
You too.